So the sexual revolution, what was the potency of women before the sexual revolution?
Hmm.
And then how did everything change? What was it about the sexual revolution that changed women and men
Hmm.
as well?
So again, we had to like have context here of how history is written and transmitted through the time and eras. So typically, what we know about like the sexual revolution was that it empowered women for sexual access and liberation. Prior
Mm,
to that, it would be very taboo for a woman to like sleep around. Not that it wasn't being done, but it was being done clandestinely, in secret.
mm, mhm,
Um, and the power that women had before the sexual revolution, and this is where you could bring in people kind of like bring in the argument that that's gendered, was motherhood, the ability to choose if they wanted that or not. And the sexual revolution and feminism painted that as oppression,
mm,
like that wives were simply like sex objects and in a usurious relationship with their husbands. I mean, this was the picture painted by the the history of the time, right? What became the dominant narrative that we know now, right? But prior to that, women have always been able to work. It's just there were certain capacities in that frame of like capitalism or like the corporate world where the biological truths that make men men and make women women were very visceral. So in the 1950s, for instance, you have a lot of these like situations where a woman was a corporate secretary. She was a secretary.
mm,
There, she was a flight stewardess, right? You can't even use that word anymore. You have to use attendant now, right? There was always like a female role that was always it looked like a supporting role
mm,
to like, stewardesses and then the pilot. There were no female pilots before like the 1980s, for instance. Um, Similarly, there were women were associated more with, again, like these, what history paints as these secondary roles to men. And so, what egalitarianism still does is try to say, well, there's no difference with a male CEO and a female CEO. But when you go down to our bodies, like these things that we live in and that
mhm,
our hormones compose like our unique genetic mix and chemistry, there are differences. There are. And these are the things that we always had. Like we always had power over our bodies. Yes, there are some, and I say some because usually history paints it as all men were abusive to women. But it's
mhm,
really, and I believe Jordan Peterson was the one who said this to a feminist that he was having an interview with. You're limiting your accusation to like a few elite men in society who did abuse their power. So we're talking about the leaders of industry,
mhm,
the leaders of like capitalism in corporate America, and building out the entire foundation of what we have now as conglomerates, right? He's like, you're limiting the evil men to a few
right.
and applying it to all men. And that was successful. It was a successful venture because now you have little girls screaming girl power right out of the
Mm,
womb and they don't even know why. They don't know where that came from. And this is how we know that women epigenetically have power too, because you're carrying that baby in utero and then she's birthed into a world where we already know through epigenetics that we carry cellular memory like in our tissues.
mhm,
You're birthing little girls with these narratives that our grandmothers saw to fruition in their generation, because our grandmothers were in the thick of that in the 60s and the 70s, right? Um, so epigenetically, it's in us, and it just feels so normal when you walk into, like, for example, I went to an international school growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it was quite a woke school, if I may use that word, and I had no idea that it was that. It was just, this is what it is, like climate change, and everybody is equal. Women can do what men can do, and women can do. I was 6 years old, the first time I went
Yeah.
to an international school. Like, we lived abroad, so expatriate life brought us into these spaces of melting pots of culture. It was normal for me. I only started to extrapolate this when I was already married. And even when I was married, I was still, we grew up in the church, my husband and I. So in the church, one of the few spaces now that still has those gender roles, right? Again, my voice and my air quotes
Mm-hmm.
give away my relationship with that word. Um, but they still have that there, and it's both a virtue and a villainous thing, even within that seemingly sacred and holy realm of Christianity, right? There's still like distortions there. And I didn't know, because when I stepped into my marriage, I was like, yes, like, based on how I grew up, he is my husband, I am his wife, like, we will be faithful to each other. But somehow, the whole ideology seemed to seep in, even in that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's very the history of like women's power is very complicated, because our power as women first is that we're born biologically valuable. That's one. And that has not been propagated in women and in girls since, like, even prior to the sexual revolution. That was not spoken into. The only time I've actually witnessed that being spoken into, like, we're born biologically valuable, is in a science class at the college level, taking up anthropology. That's it. It's left there in the kind of like the echelons of like academia. It should be brought out into the light, into like the lives of little girls and little boys, so that little boys and little girls may know from the get-go that there are differences between male and female, that a female must be protected, and the feminine in her must be protected, and that little boys, they must be allowed to thrive and to discover their strength, and to use it towards the protection of women, towards the cherishment of women. These are all codified in like biological laws that they study in anthropological studies. But
So
if
is a
we,
woman
yeah.
different than born, sorry, love, born biologically valuable? Is a man born biologically valuable?
Yeah, so that term, we have to understand the anthropology lens of that term, right?
Yeah.
So the reason why females, let's call it female, are valuable even among animals is because they carry the progeny. Like, that's our function. We have wombs, we have uteruses, we have the capacity to hold life. But we need the male to be able to do that, right? And the reason why they use this word valuable is because males in nature, the characteristic is that they are disposable. And again, when you bring men and women into this, the whole argument starts, right? But when you look at it based on nature, it makes sense. So in nature, for instance, you look at a beehive, okay? The only purpose of all the males there is to mate with the queen bee, right? Um, and then after that, they become disposable. You'll see female drones which what you call like they're not like the queen, they're not the alpha female, right? But they are the workers. They kill the male bees after they have um, fertilized the female, the queen, and that is why you see a lot of dead bees around a beehive. Those are males that have been disposed of. But the thing is, they know that that is their function. They're like, okay, the purpose here is to make more bees. So after I have done my duty, I will die. Bring that to the topside world. That's actually the function of very masculine men. That's why when you look at our history, the men were the soldiers, the men were the ones that defended the tribe, the men put their lives in front of their wives and their children. And that is why they are disposable according to biological laws. Again, I have to put a caveat around that, those two words. Females are valuable because of progeny. Males are disposable because they live for the purpose to preserve that progeny to the death. And that is why you teach, I hope they still teach this, but like you teach boys how to protect girls. And of course, yes, girls know how to protect themselves. Like my own daughter does martial arts, but that does not remove her from the other aspects of her that make her a potential woman in her adulthood and a girl, like a feminine girl now.
Yeah.
So biology gives us clues to what is true and fundamental. And then as humans, we have a God given intelligence, we have sovereignty, we have agency to discern, does this feel congruent with like like me being a woman and me being a man? And when we see it playing out like in families, right? My father, for instance, he always taught my brothers, and they are younger than me, you have to look out for your sister. When she's walking on the sidewalk with you, you walk on the outside where the cars are passing. Like I first saw that in my brothers because my dad taught them that, and his father taught him that. So again, these are clues to these biological truths about men and women that real men put themselves in the line of fire to protect a woman. Sadly, that's been distorted, like it's been thrown out, like the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater, essentially, in the conversations we have about what women can do and what men can do. But the conversation actually has to be, and Dr. Pat Allen, um, relationship psychologist, said this. She's like, women have to feel good in order to do good. And when do we feel good? When we know that we are protected, we're safe. That's why you have all of this, is it a safe space, coming out of like the feminist narratives, right? And then men, they have to know, they have to do good in order to feel good, she said. And that plays into that biological truth of if I'm not useful, I'm disposable. Plays into the fact that most suicides are by men because they feel useless. And again, there's so much that I could get into here, and I often do in spaces with men and women now. But it's all going back to male and female. God created them a certain way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's see how that is and where that shows up.